Hi, Mike Brantley, auctioneer, here with you today, and talking about a phrase I use quite frequently, which is stay in your lane. Analogous to driving, and not that when you're driving you have to stay in your lane. I mean, you can switch lanes obviously when you're driving, but when you're an auctioneer and you have an item up, a lot, an individual lot, and selling with reserve, for example, and it reaches the reserve. So this item has a reserve of $35,000, and if we get to 35, then it's going to truly sell. If we don't get to 35, it's probably not going to sell. But 35 is enough for the seller to sell it to the highest bidder for 35 or more. Some auctioneers will say at that moment that they reach a bid of 35,000. Now this item is selling absolute, and no, it's not. No, it's not. It's still a with reserve auction. You've met the reserve, but you want to stay in your lane. You want to stay with reserve. See, if you change the auction type or attempt to change the auction type, you say, now this is an absolute auction. You are essentially withdrawing the item from the with reserve auction and canceling all the bids and restarting the property absolute and at zero. And so you don't want to do that. It isn't that you can say, well, I've got a with reserve auction and I'm going to take this 35 and I'm going to move that $35,000 over to an absolute auction, because that bidder could say, well, no, you're not. And I'm going to bid 20. Well, that's not enough for your seller, but now it's absolute. And now that bidder's bid 20, so it has to sell because it can't be withdrawn. So it's just a terrible idea. No reason to do it. To say when you reach the reserve, now it's absolute. As well, if you're selling something absolute, and let's say it's the same item, and the seller says, well, I hope we get to 35,000. We're only at 22,000. 23,000, 24,000. We're not at 35. And the seller comes up to the auctioneer and says, hey, we're going to have to change that over to a with reserve because I can't take, $23,000 for that thing. I can't do it. I was hoping for 35. You told me you thought you could get to 35. Well, you cannot change that type of auction from an absolute auction without reserve auction over to a with reserve auction. And again, our underlying construct here is that if you change the type or attempt to change the type, you are canceling that auction and having another auction. And in an absolute auction, once you've received a bid, once an auctioneer has received a bid on an article or lot that's been put up for auction within a reasonable time, that item that lot cannot be withdrawn. And so you can't withdraw it, and there's nothing you can do at that point. And the seller can't bid because that's a reserve and it's absolute. And yeah, obviously if you've got a seller that says, well, I don't want to take any less than $35,000 for that item, and and that isn't academic, that it'll bring 35, or clearly it'll bring 35, then maybe an absolute auction wasn't a good fit to start with, although auctioneers do find themselves in that situation. So stay in your lane. Now, backing up from that, could you have an auction event where some items are selling absolute and some items are selling with reserve? And the answer is yes. And so you can put up this item and say this item selling absolute, and it gets up to $27,000, and you say sold, and the next item is with reserve. It has to bring 25,000, and the bidding line gets up to 23. Okay, we're not going to sell that. We pass it, move to the next item. Could you mix and match? Yes. Yes. Lots of auction events have some items selling absolute, some items selling with reserve. Or I was just saw an auction ad here the other day where all the personal property was selling absolute. The car and the real property, a house and barn, were selling with reserve, and that's not hard to find necessarily. So you can have an auction event where everything's selling absolute or everything's selling with reserve, but you can also mix up, because each lot, each property that comes up for bids is an individual lot, and that lot can have terms such as absolute or with reserve, either or. So hopefully that sheds some light on staying in your lane. I'm Mike Brantley, auctioneer. Pleasure to be with you. There are other videos here on this same page and others forthcoming. Have a great day and stay safe.